So where are the students? Put your hand up so I can see where you are. So the rest of you, you can check your cell phones or whatever. I'm going to talk to the students. You know, usually it's the other way around, right? They're all listening and you guys are checking your phones. But so I want to talk to you and tell you a few things I hope you'll always remember from this day. First of all, today is 9/11. I think you were all too young to be aware of that, but I know exactly where I was on 9/11 when I saw the first image of those buildings coming down. And it's an experience that's riveted in me. Terrorists, and what they can do. And terrorism still an issue that we confront today. Tomorrow, 9/12, is another date that's very meaningful for all of us associated with the World Food Prize. That is the day in 2009 when our founder, Norman Borlaug, died, at the age 95. I want to tell you a little bit about him. And then I want to also tell you about a man who's just like him from Nebraska, Dr. Hank Beechel. So let's all be honest, students. I saw all the hands that went up. I kind of know where you are, how many are. Who's ever heard of Norman Borlaug or know anything about him? Don't fake it now. Oh, that's good. Yeah, okay. And Hank Beechel? Okay. So here's the way to start with those two. 1862, Senator Justin Morrill introduced a bill that was passed to establish land-grant universities. It was a deal with railroads, so railroads would get the right-of-way, but they had to buy land and give it for universities. And Abraham Lincoln signed it in the middle of the Civil War. All the graduates, and this is land-grant institution, University of Nebraska, like Iowa State is, and so many others around the U.S. So all the history of all the land-grant institutions in the United States of America, all their graduates in terms of life achievements, of life accomplishments, in my opinion, and nobody's refuted this, the two greatest graduates of any land-grant institution anywhere in the last 153 years are Hank Beechel and Norman Borlaug. Now, when I took over the World Food Prize, I used to meet groups just like you in Iowa. And I'd ask the students, who's heard of Norman Borlaug? And almost no hand would go up. And I said, how can it be? So I'm going to tell you what they did and why it's significant and how it relates to 9/11. So Borlaug is born on a farm in northeast Iowa, Howard County, outside Cresco, in 1914. Hank Beechel was born in 1906, I think in Waverly, Nebraska. Borlaug grows up on a corn farm. Beechel on a wheat farm. Somehow in the Depression, as they would say, is you went to work where the job was. Borlaug ended up working on wheat, and Beechel ended up working on rice. And Borlaug we in Iowa say he only made one mistake in life. He went to the University of Minnesota instead of going to Iowa State. I guess we'd say it'd be the equivalent if he went to the University of Nebraska, or you'd say is if Beechel had gone to Iowa State or something like that. So always gets a good laugh when I tell the story at the University of Minnesota and that. But he gets a PhD. Borlaug gets a PhD in plant pathology, and he goes to Mexico and he spends 20 years working with the poorest farmers, out with them, sometimes pulling the plow himself with almost no money, trying to develop a strand of wheat that would be double or triple the yield and disease resistant. Because rust disease is a terrible scourge that affects wheat wherever it's grown around the world. And Borlaug is trying, and he's crossing. I'm a political science major, so I don't know anything about agriculture on this, but I know I've learned some of the words, and he's crossing different varieties and kind of marrying them, introducing wheat from Mexico to wheat from the United States, and they get together, they produce new plants, trying to find this. And he gets a wheat plant so it's so tall, and it's just full of grain, but it falls over. It's called lodging for some reason. Maybe later, Dean, or you can explain to me where the term comes from. But it fall over. And he can't make it work until he hears that there are some seeds that have come from Japan, from a scientist who's working in 1935 who had grown dwarf wheat. And after World War II, the American Army rounded up all their land grant graduates, sent them out to try to promote agriculture in Japan. And they came upon these seeds, and they sent some back to colleagues and friends in the United States, and they're sharing with everybody, and Borlaug gets some of them. And the name of the seeds were called Norin 10. And he uses those to crossbreed with his Mexican wheat, and it's the eureka moment. Because now the plants have stronger legs. They're thick like a Nebraska offensive lineman's legs. And the plant can stand up, and it can produce that triple the yield. And it's the moment that comes in the early 1960s. And it so changes the villages and areas in Mexico where he's working that he becomes a hero to people. If you go to Obregon in Sonora, in Mexico, there's a statue of Norman Borlaug, put up and paid for by the Mexican farmers. When he died in 2012, the headline was this big in the newspaper. Can you imagine? I can't imagine many places in the world where people in another country would put money in to put up a statue of an American about anything. That's the kind of person Borlaug was. Borlaug is then invited by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, to go to India and Pakistan, which are facing mass starvation. The great Bengal famine of the 1940s had killed 3 million people in what's now Bangladesh. And India, with its huge population, and Pakistan, who are at war with each other, are facing the same thing. And Borlaug goes back and forth and convinces the leaders of both countries to change their whole approach to agriculture, to use irrigation, to use fertilizer, and to use his new seeds, the ones made with the Japanese and Mexican varieties that have been crossed. And it works. And they go from facing huge deficits to self-sufficiency and then to surpluses in just a few years. As you'll hear later, about a month from now, the Nobel Prizes are announced. And what happens when the Nobel Prize is given, people in Sweden and in Norway calculate what time it is, and they call the person, wherever they are in the world, to say, oh, just want to let you know you've won the Nobel Prize in chemistry or medicine or literature or the Nobel Peace Prize. So they look and they call to Mexico thinking, oh, it's about 7 o'clock in the morning. We'll catch Norman Borlaug there to tell him he's been chosen to receive the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize. So the phone rings, and his wife answers the phone, and of course Norm's not there because he left 2 hours earlier and driven out to the fields, and he's out working. So there's this moment where his wife gets in the car, she drives more than an hour to where he's working, and as described to me by people who were there, she's running across the field, waving her arm like this. It looks like a scene from some movie. And she's calling, Norm, Norm, you have to come home and talk to Oslo. You've won the Nobel Peace Prize. So Dr. Borlaug is this sort of taciturn, no-nonsense Norwegian guy. And he looks at her, and he looks up at the sky, and he said, there's 2 more hours of light. I can't possibly go. Now get out of here. And he sends her away. And so it's dark when the TV cameras from Mexico City get there, and they're interviewing him. And here this Norwegian immigrant whose family left Norway in the middle of the 19th century because, just like Ireland, they had had a terrible potato famine and had come and settled in Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin. And here he's called back to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And Borlaug was considered the father of the Green Revolution, because that's what happened. This amazing impact of agricultural research that had been fostered by Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa State, Illinois, all of these great schools had paid off and had started what would become the single greatest period of food production and hunger reduction in all human history, the last 60 years. More people have been uplifted out of poverty and hunger than at any time in the history of our species. And Norman Borlaug was at the forefront of this. Now, Norman Borlaug, after he received the Nobel Peace Prize, he went to the Nobel Committee and he said, there needs to be a prize for agriculture. It's really important. You see that now. So could you please get one started right away? So, the Nobel Committee, they wanted to be nice to him. He's a Peace Prize laureate. And they said, oh, Dr. Borlaug, we're so sorry, but we don't have the money, and it's not in Alfred Nobel's will, so we can't do that. And kind of shoot him out the door. So he's this determined guy. He was a wrestler. He's in the NC2A Wrestling Hall of Fame. Learned that never give up tenacity on the wrestling mats. And he doesn't give up, and finally he finds a corporate sponsor in 1986, General Foods Company in New York, and they become the sponsor and the founder of the World Food Prize, which you're all here today. As Borlaug wants it to be the Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. And he gets it going, and it's going pretty good. They have a couple of winners. The first one, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan from India, just turned 90, the most revered agricultural scientist on the face of the earth living today. And he'll be in Des Moines in October. And in 1990, the World Food Prize is about to disappear because there's a corporate restructuring, General Foods disappears, and it's about to go out of existence. And Borlaug is running around trying to find somebody who's going to keep it going, who put a little money in. And he shows up in Iowa. He's 77 years of age, and he meets another man who's 77 named John Ruan, who had a trucking business, and there's still a trucking company. And Dr. Bruce Maunder wouldn't be here except a Ruan truck saved him in a snowstorm once. he was able to follow the Ruan truck out in a blinding Nebraska snowstorm, and he's safe. And that, so it's the other reason to know about Ruan. And John Ruan, a trucker in Des Moines, and he wanted to make Des Moines the food and agricultural capital of the world. Of course, here you all know it's in Nebraska, right? Iowa's, right. So I have to say that. It's written in Brooks' contract that she gave me. So the World Food Prize moves to Des Moines. It's been there ever since. I came and took over in 1999, and I've been there for 15 years ever since, and building this program. Now, and it's now, when I came, I had one employee, my special assistant and our senior administrative officer, Crystal Harris, is here. In 2000, it would have just been me and her. That was the whole World Food Prize staff, just one person. Of course, Crystal was in grade school then, so not. But and that. So today we're much bigger, and maybe 50 people came to the World Food Prize. Then last year there were 1,200 who came. So where does Hank Beechel fit in all this? And where does it relate to 9/11? So when I grew up in eastern Iowa, I went to a little college. I knew nothing about agriculture. I knew nothing about these issues. And unlike you, unlike all of you who are here, I had no interest. I was a political science major. I was interested in government, and I took the Foreign Service exam to become a diplomat. And so either I passed the test or somehow they got my scores mixed up with some guy from Princeton or Yale or something. But anyway, I got in. And I'm driving to Washington, D.C. It's 1967. There were cars then, I assure you. And you can imagine, I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to be going to Rome. I'm going to be in London, in Paris. I'm going to be going to all these fancy parties and sipping whatever it is they sip at them, and talking with other diplomats and calling them, oh, Your Excellency, this and that. Wow, what a life it's going to be. And before I knew what happened, I was trained to speak Vietnamese, put on a plane, and flown to Asia, and not at the embassy, not in the capital city, not in the regional capital, not in the provincial capital. I wasn't in the Omaha or the Lincoln. I was out in a county and a district advisor in this remote part of Vietnam in the Mekong Delta, working with farmers who were growing rice. How did I get here? How did this happen? I woke up and there I am. People speaking this strange language, growing rice, doing all these things. And then I had the moment that shaped all the rest of my life, all the rest of my career, and it all had to do with Hank Beechel. Now, Hank Beechel, as you know, grew up in Nebraska on a farm. He goes to University of Nebraska, distinguished graduate. Not for me to say who's the most important graduate of this university, aside from the football players who won the Heisman Trophy and the national championship, and Bob Devaney, of course. But he goes and gets graduate degrees at Kansas State and goes to work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the job is available in rice, and he becomes a rice specialist. And he has a career at USDA. He retires, and they're looking for somebody to go to the Philippines and work at the International Rice Research Institute. And he goes there, and like Borlaug, he works for a decade or more, and finally he introduces rice from Taiwan to rice from Indonesia. There's a cross, a new plant, and it is the eureka moment of rice. because it is IR8. And IR8 is the rice that can be double or triple the yield, disease resistant. Rice gets rust disease, and it can grow in half the time of traditional rice. So here I am in the Mekong Delta, at a place called Sadek. Interestingly, Secretary of State John Kerry was a young naval officer there at the same time. I used to think, I wonder if we ever sat at the same table eating once and there. But he was there driving around on boats, and I was out in villages. And the IR8 shows up, and it's getting introduced by agricultural extension workers who are convincing farmers, hey, you ought to try this. So I'm overseeing this and working on other things. And I have 8 villages where I'm the advisor. And we, by chance, are upgrading an old road that runs through those 8 villages. Old road built by the French when they were the colonial ruler. And it had deteriorated very badly. So we had engineers come in, they'd grade it, they'd put gravel on it, they'd put culverts in so that the water could run under the road and not undermine it. And we had finished fixing the road through 4 of the 8 villages. And it was then that I saw what happened. Because every place we fixed the road, farmers started using the IR8 rice. And it had such a profound impact. It changed the life of everybody who used it and all of their family almost overnight, in just a year. Because now a farmer could get 2 crops, high yielding, didn't taste as good as the traditional rice, but you could sell it. And people that haul it away up to the capital city, you'd get more money. You could also have time to grow a 3rd crop, maybe some melons or cantaloupe. And now families had extra income. The key to eradicating poverty for farmers is higher yield 2nd crop, more money, because now you can buy better food, you can buy more nutritious food, you can feed your family. So I'd drive through these villages, and I'd notice here's this lush green IR8 rice growing that Hank Beechel, never heard of Hank Beechel then, but I saw it everywhere. The houses now are looking better. They got metal roofing on top of their house. And children look better clothed. They look better fed. Child mortality goes down because now a mom, when she has a sick child, can get out on the road to get to medical help in time. And this was really unexpected. This was the middle of the Vietnam War. We were fighting against this underground guerrilla movement who lived in the villages. You could never get at them. You tried to bomb them. You brought in extra troops, boots on the ground. Never could get rid of them. Suddenly, in those villages that had the road and the rice, the guerrillas, the terrorists, the insurgents disappeared. They evaporated because the prosperity brought by the rice and the roads undermined it. And it was the lesson of my life. The combination of roads and new agricultural technology. But what I didn't realize, that I realize now, is that we should have known it because that's the lesson of America. That is the lesson of how Nebraska and Iowa and Minnesota and all of the states in America, how every one of them developed. Because you can do all the research you want at the University of Nebraska and have all the development, but if you can't get the extension workers out to the farmers, you might as well forget about doing it. And it was those roads, that network of roads, that let companies now have their salesmen. Henry Wallace, Vice President of the United States, the man who developed hybrid corn, and that his salesmen could go out on those roads. Families had kids, farm family, their kids now could get on that bus or in that car and go to high school and get to the university. Everything about our country, everything about this part of the world, everything about today's enormous agricultural productivity is traced back to that combination of land-grant institutions, research, companies, research, extension, and roads. Because in my villages, in my district, the other 4 villages that didn't have the road, nobody used the new rice, get on a little sampan and go across and ride down the bumpy road. There was nobody growing IR8 rice. There was nobody with a better house. Kids weren't in school. They look run down, shabby, badly dressed. And there I was, the guy who wasn't interested in agriculture, perceiving that the center of things were agriculture. So fast forward 20 years to 1990, and I'm now Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and I showed up in Cambodia. So Cambodia's Southeast Asian Buddhist country, right next to Vietnam. 7 million people, most wonderful, beautiful country. Incredible art and architecture. And this incredible, radical, terrorist, genocidal, mass murdering organization called the Khmer Rouge, led by a man named Pol Pot, imposed their will and transformed the country. They emptied every city, every town, every village. So imagine in June of 1973, I was standing on the top of a hill in Vietnam looking into Cambodia, and every village, as far as you could see, in every direction in Cambodia was on fire. And there's black smoke coming up out of them. I had no idea what it could be until I talked to refugees. That was the day the Khmer Rouge forced everybody to leave their home, and to ensure no one would ever go back, they burned every house down and forced them to live in the jungle and now farm collectively. 7 million people. 4 years later, it was a country of 5 million. 2 million people were dead in 4 years. And in 1990, when the international community in the United States got back in there, there were still 25,000 Khmer Rouge. The North Vietnamese army, greatest jungle fighting army in the history of the world, or people said had tried for 10 years, couldn't get rid of them. I had $11 million of your taxpayer money. And I said to the aid staff, go rent all the road grading equipment you can find and drive it from Thailand into Cambodia and start fixing roads. And we did that. And in Cambodia, with $11 million, you can get a lot of road grading equipment in 1990. And we brought in new agricultural technology. And the roads sort of act like the bloodstream when somebody has cancer and you get chemotherapy. I hope nobody in the room has that. Forgive me for using it as an example, but The roads are like the bloodstream. The agricultural technology is like the chemotherapy, and it takes it out to the tumor to be destroyed. There's 25,000 Khmer Rouge. 9 years later, when I was leaving there, I had served as ambassador. Great honor to represent your country as an ambassador. I got a phone call, and it was a report that the last Khmer Rouge had surrendered. We had eradicated the worst genocidal mass murdering organization of the second half of the 20th century using that formula that Beecher and Borlaug knew that transformed our country of building roads and new agricultural technology. So now on 9/11, as we think about what do we do to deal with terrorism in the world, one of the greatest resources, I hesitate to call it a weapon, one of the greatest assets we have as a country and a people is the agricultural innovation, the biotechnology, the learned people. When he was Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates told me, when I told him this story about how Norman Borlaug believed in roads and agriculture. And he interrupted me and he said, every one of my commanders in Afghanistan tell me the same thing, that in Afghanistan, where the road ends, the insurgency begins. So now we face two big issues. Terrorism, 9/11 reminds us of that. Terrible things that go on every day in the world reminds us of that. And that we have 2 billion more people to be fed in just 35 years. And most of us, we're leaving that problem to you all. You're the ones who are going to decide whether we get over that or not. So bear in mind, in my view, this challenge, can we sustainably and nutritiously feed 9+ billion people, is the single biggest challenge our species, the human race, has ever faced. And I say that knowing it's a really big deal to be able to fly a rocket ship past Pluto or land the Mars rover on Mars. But this is about human suffering. This is about people having enough food. You can't see the stories about migration in Europe. All on the front page, right? Some coming from Syria. Why? Because of the terrorism. Others coming from Libya and North Africa, across in boats, because there's not enough food. There's going to be another 1 billion people in Africa alone. And if they don't have enough food and enough to eat and a better life, they are going to be on boats going to where the food is. Because that's the history of the human species on our planet. So all these issues that you're looking at, that you're writing your papers about, they're all focused on this. This should be the most inspiring thing to all of you and to everyone who comes through your schools and comes to this university. The College of Agriculture, the Institute of Agriculture, it's the most important, I guess, aside from the football program, okay? So no heresy in Nebraska, on this campus. Now, the other thing that we see and hear a lot about is Iran, right? The Iran agreement, nuclear agreement, my goodness. I don't know nuclear technology, so I don't want to say anything about the agreement. It's a good agreement, bad. You can decide that for yourself. But Iran, adversarial country. But the thing I learned along the way from Norman Borlaug and Hank Beechel is that agriculture is the way to bring people together across even the broadest chasms, the broadest differences, be they political, diplomatic, ethnic, religious, racial, whatever, confronting hunger and dealing with agriculture. In 1959, I believe, was the most dangerous moment in human history. The United States and the Soviet Union were poised to fire nuclear weapons at each other. And Soviet Premier Khrushchev came to the UN in New York, and he accepted an invitation out of the blue to go to Iowa and visit a farm. And he ends up in Coon Rapids, which is, great farm, close to the Nebraska border, under the cultural influence of Nebraska. And he's there with this farmer named Roswell Garst, and they're out at the corn crib. And they're looking at ears of corn, and Khrushchev's saying, why can't I have corn like this in the Soviet Union? And that leads to exchanges over the next several decades that had nothing to do with whether nuclear arms reduction or nuclear treaties between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but had everything to do with building some modicum of trust, of understanding, of some opening, of some sense that you could work together. Now, I told you before there's a statue of Norman Borlaug in Mexico. There's also one in India where he's considered to be the man who saved 1 billion lives, saved Indians from mass starvation. And last March of 2014, there's a statue now of Norman Borlaug in the U.S. Capitol, put there by the state of Iowa. But there's one other place where people in a country wanted to erect a statue of Norman Borlaug. And that country was Iran. Norman Borlaug is a hero in Iran because he espoused biotechnology, genetic modification, and they believed deeply in it. And so they invited me to come to Iran, former American ambassador, probably considered a spy by their intelligence people. They invited me to come and speak, and I went. And they had tried to buy a copy of the statue that's in the U.S. Capitol to erect it on their agricultural campus in Iran. And I got there and I said, I had to give a speech. So a room like this, there was about 400 people. Here's the Minister of Agriculture sitting. Next to him is the representative of the Grand Ayatollah. So they're watching every word I say. I'm saying, it's 8 o'clock. It was like about this time. I'm saying, how did I get in this spot? And I wonder if I'm going to get out of here without being put in jail. There's no American embassy there. So I told them a story about Khrushchev and about the Garst farm, about the high point of nuclear tensions, and about agricultural exchange. And then I said, I want to tell you a secret. The secret is that Norman Borlaug's dream was that someday somebody using biotechnology would look into the rice plant and figure out what is it in the rice plant that keeps it from ever getting rust disease. Remember? Rust disease. And they'll transplant it into wheat and forever eliminate that scourge from the face of the earth. And I said, here, you Iranians, you have an institute about biotechnology. And Americans work on biotechnology. You should send somebody to the World Food Prize. And they did, to be part of our panel last year on the Borlaug Global Rust Initiative. And I said, just imagine if working together, that Iranians and Americans could make that achievement. And we could have a moment where we all came together and stood together and cheered together for the same thing, for a great achievement. And I stepped back, I finished, and I thought, I wonder what's going to happen now. And what happened is that the Iranians all stood up and gave me a standing ovation. Me, the only senior American official ever invited to come to Iran to speak to them. So someplace in there's some place for agriculture, for hope, for building bridges, for defeating terrorism, for feeding all the people who are going to be on our planet. So good of you all to be here today, because you have the potential and you've taken that step to being part of what will make our planet a better and safer place. So good luck today. Thanks for having me on here on your campus. Good luck against South Alabama tomorrow night. Shouldn't have to say that, but so thank you very much.